okay? I think this is the right height. We've adjusted it a few times this morning. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking Brian in particular and the team for putting together such a fabulous seminar. I think we all agree. And it really is an honour for me to be speaking alongside such experts in the field, including colleagues of mine both from the past, the present, and hopefully the future. The years between 1800 and 1900, as Brian's just introduced, saw major developments in European ceramic production and the types of services used for dining. This short lecture that I'm going to give cannot be a comprehensive study, and instead what I want to do is showcase a selection of the V&A's rich collection of ceramic table services, and as Ryan's just mentioned, made from factories as wide apart as Sèvres and Stoke-on-Trent, although they weren't so far apart and removed from each other. And I also hope to show that by highlighting these wide-ranging ceramic design styles of the period, and arguably, I would say, some of the best quality ceramics ever made in the 19th century, that I can convince you that the long 19th century deserves our attention, and it shouldn't be seen as the lesser period of ceramic production. Just defending my corner here. So I start with this slide showing a variety of types of mid-19th century dining, both from formal to domestic, really to give a sense of the context of dining services amidst the interiors and decoration and architecture, and just to make the point that ceramics were not used in isolation. And I think this is the joy of this seminar today and yesterday, is that we've focused on ceramics, but we've taken in the context of silver, of cloth, of the interiors and the sugar decoration. I think we do have to see that all of these types of decorative arts were influencing each other, they were related to each other, but equally they were taking designs styles together. And ultimately they were the choice of people putting them together. Patricia has already talked to you this morning wonderfully about Felbrigg Hall, and I took this photograph when I was visiting with my mother a couple of years ago, and I just thought it was a wonderful image of the table here. Yes, an 18th century dining room, but the table is actually set for a dinner party hosted by the Ketton family in the 1860s, showing the continuing taste here for a service à la française, and there's wonderful, I think they're all plastic foodstuffs on the table, but really to give you a sense of the style. Top right, we have this wonderful stereoscopic card of the Victorian family, possibly by J. Eliot, around 1860, and it shows, albeit a staged, a less formal family gathering, and I just love the fact that the dog is part of the scene as well. And a take on the aesthetic middle to upper classes in Georges du Maurier's illustration for Punch magazine in 1884. So throughout the 19th century, a variety of styles of ceramic services were required to suit different uses and ever-changing fashions and different tastes. From the start of the century, design influences were indeed shared across many of the European ceramic factories, and I show here just one example from the pattern books of Minton, Stoke-on-Trent. The archive, I should say, for those who don't already know, is safe, and it was gifted by the Art Fund to the Stoke-on-Trent City Archives, so anyone can make an appointment to go and see it, and is available online as well. Fabulous resource. And also designs from Sèvres, here for tableware, which show marked similarities in the use of neoclassical, Regency and Empire styles. But an important aspect of the development of design styles in the 19th century was through improved and increased production. The Industrial Revolution led to technological advances that saw ceramic production in Europe, particularly in England, supersede imports from China. As before, large numbers of plates and dishes were required, and for many factories, tablewares were an essential part of production throughout the 19th century. I show here images actually from the 1920s of the Minton factory, but the methods would have been very familiar to the workers in the 19th century, and indeed to workers in other factories of the period. So tablewares contributed significantly to the British ceramics market and its dominance and stability, whether it's ironstones, semi-porcelains, bone china, earthenwares, they were all produced in vast quantities, reflecting the various design styles required. Bone china in particular, and here of Minton, was recognised to be of exquisite quality. And I have the backing of Antoine d'Albis, who agreed with me when I dared to propose in an FPS lecture a couple of years ago that it was the body of bone china was superior in quality in the 19th century to the earlier paste of Sèvres porcelain. Aesthetics are a different consideration. I wouldn't dare to go there, but we're talking about the chemical body. And the company established its reputation as a supplier of special services to the royal and aristocratic families of Europe. Another contributing factor for the emergence of ever more new designs was through shopping. The expansion of trade in the 18th and 19th centuries, alongside industrial production, resulted in large china warehouses, showrooms, and department stores, which opened up a world of shopping to the burgeoning middle classes, who are eager to buy dinner services for entertaining at home. And I show here a wonderful detail of a fairly famous print of Wedgwood's showroom in London, in York Street, of 1809. And here another wonderful image later in the century, almost the tail end, 1893, from Brown Westhead Moore & Co. And it's their factory showroom in Stoke-on-Trent. And many people actually went to the potteries and bought their ceramics directly from the factories, from the showrooms there. And today, the likes of Thomas Good and Co. on South Audley Street still give customers, contemporary customers, a taste of that 19th century shopping experience. And customers had more and more options to choose from, both in the finished products and by stipulating their own preferences to the manufacturer. Pattern plates, which I show here, are quite rare, being part of the manufacture process, and they often don't survive. They were used both as factory samples to show prospective clients and as records of patterns, and their reference numbers are used for internal factory use. The left-hand example on screen here we bought in 2008 and shows the stylistic options for tableware in Paris around 1840. And you can see it juxtaposes Gothic, polychrome, and floral naturalism alongside more stylized floral borders. And we've not actually been able to identify the factories, so if anyone has any ideas, please let me know. I discussed this with Errol and others, but if anyone recognizes any of the patterns, I'd be most grateful. And porcelain manufacture at this time was fiercely competitive and financially risky. Therefore, factories came up with ever more varied designs, elaborate decoration, and wide ranges of tableware for the customer. The Spode plate on the right-hand side, which the V&A bought in 2012, is even more unusual, having been made specifically for a customer of a bespoke dinner service to show the possible choices of border decorations for the commission. The combination of the lack of pattern numbers for the different border designs renders it useless as a showroom or retailer's piece. And the meticulously painted crest in the centre, which I haven't managed to identify, so if anyone recognises it, although I think a trip to the Spode archive, again in the Stoke-on-Trent Staffordshire archives, probably will give me the final answer, because they have a wonderful a list of various crests. More research to be done. The Spode armorial crest in the centre suggests that it was a one-off commission and a trial plate specifically for the person who was commissioning the service. And Spode armorial painting was some of the finest quality produced. And the highly gilded borders, which relate to designs in the pattern books between 1810 and 1830, were incredibly expensive production. But grand services were commissioned and from a number of factories. And arguably, the monumental Sèvres Egyptian banqueting services of 1808 and the second of 1810-12 are some of the greatest examples of empire-style French porcelain. Comprising of elaborate dinnerwares and architectural centerpieces, the first... Oh, sorry, I'll just skip back. The first Egyptian service was given by Napoleon Bonaparte to Alexander I of Russia in 1808. And I show here an image of it laid out at the State Museum of Ceramics in Kuskovo, Russia. The second service, originally commissioned for the Empress Josephine, was given by Louis XVIII to Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, for his assistance in helping to restore the Bourbon monarchy. Now, I don't have a picture of it laid out, and indeed today when you see it at Apsley House, it's in the porcelain room, which was partly how Wellington would have displayed him, akin to how Wellington would have displayed it. But we do have this wonderful image, and I apologise, I've put John rather than Joseph Nash for the artist here, but of the Waterloo Gallery, Apsley House in 1852. So it gives you a sense of how the service would have been used. And we know that the service was used for banquets hosted by Wellington. And the service indeed shows evidence of use. And there's marks on the plates and indeed around the gilding where we can see that the plates have been stacked as well. I mean, they all need to be washed after use. So when you're doing that, you're stacking the pieces afterwards. And I show, as I say, I show here a watercolour of the gallery at Apsley House, and it's actually on the occasion of the Duke's last annual banquet to celebrate his greatest military victory. And you can see quite how impressive the setting would have been. And for these banquets, Wellington used a combination of Portuguese silver, Berlin, Meissen, and Vienna porcelain services, and kind of mixed and matched it all together. He wasn't choosing one each time. He was pulling it all together in different elements of the different services. And he included elements of the Sèvres Egyptian service. And such was the spectacle and the public interest to see the dining room banquet set ready for guests, that visitors were permitted ahead of the guest arrival with tickets, a ticketed event in advance. So really, the public interested in this dining spectacle was so evident at the time, and dining indeed was an event in itself. So to move back to the detail of the second service, which today is owned by the Victoria and Albert Museum, but largely on loan to Apsley House, the plates in the service have central views from illustrations by Vivant Denon for the published description of his journey to Egypt during Bonaparte's 1798 campaign. Denon was an artist, curator and author who worked in Italy and France and was Napoleon's Minister of Arts and the first director of the Musée Napoléon, today the Louvre. In 1786, Denon had sold a number of classical and Etruscan vases from his private collection to Louis XVI, which were added to the Sèvres factory reference collection. These vases and Denon's publication provided the inspiration for the two editions of the Sèvres service. The plate I show here, entitled Statue dit de Menon, has a central scene of the statue of Amenhotep III at Luxor, taken from Denon's published prints. And the scene was painted by J.F.J. Suibac de Fontaine at Sèvres. His signature, which I'm afraid the detail here, it is on the lower left of the image, and the gilding was by Miko Fils, and the borders designed by Alexandre Theodore Brongniart, the architect and father of Alexandre Brongniart, the director of the Sèvres factory at the time. So Empress Josephine, for whom the service was, this second edition of the service was commissioned, was involved with the commission, but eventually lost patience with the time taken to produce the set. The incredible ornate gilding and detailed painting took months to produce each shape, and today still does. In fact, just in May, I was visiting the Sèvres factory, and Tamar Preo very kindly took me round to visit the decorators, and I saw that they have been commissioned to make a new version of the Sèvres service Egyptian for a client today. So, this is if you want to get your own version, I don't know the price. I imagine it's not cheap, but you can commission. And the quality of the painting is quite exquisite. The skills at Sèvres today are continuing. The antique style, therefore, was perhaps already starting to fall out of fashion, because although delivered to Chateau Malmaison the 1st of April 1812, Josephine rejected the service as she considered the design too severe. However, it may also have been because it was partly as a diplomatic gift to her during her divorce, so who knows what politics were going on around that. But the service returned to the Sèvres factory, and on return included 72 plates with the Egyptian scenes. However, when the service was given to the Duke of Wellington, only 66 of these plates were accounted for. So 10 plates in total, including 4 extras, have therefore been dispersed or lost. Until 1979, the surviving service remained with the Dukes of Wellington when it was acquired by the V&A under the guidance of the late, great, and much missed Charlie Truman. Today, this plate that I show here is the only one displayed in the V&A Museum in the Europe galleries, and as I say, the remaining service, including the centrepiece, this fabulous biscuit porcelain centrepiece here, is on loan to Apsley House, and you can see it in the porcelain room there. But not all dinnerwares in the 19th century were quite so luxurious, and many factories catered for different price points. In Britain, blue and white decoration is most strongly associated with printing on ceramics, a technique pioneered in the 1750s and brought to a mass market by 1800. Printing became one of the main methods of decoration for factory ceramics, and in 1855, the author Jane Mayer stated, and I quote, "The art of transfer printing has helped to make English pottery famous throughout the civilized world, and has done much towards making its production one of the greatest staple manufacturers of the country." So printing allowed for the increased production of ceramics for a global market with high quality and technically precise decoration. And the value of printed wares has changed dramatically over the last 2 centuries. When first introduced, printed ceramics were highly desirable. In fact, Wedgwood price lists of 1814 show quite clearly that their printed wares were retailed at a higher price point than their painted wares. And I show here a selection from the many services of blue and white printed wares in the V&A Wedgwood collection at World of Wedgwood, Barlaston, near Stoke-on-Trent. I would urge you all to visit if you haven't already. An amazing collection, as many of you know, and I should remind you that V&A and Art Fund members get free entry should you need any more enticement. Not only was printing a guaranteed method of replicating more popular patterns and images, but for the first time, entire services could exactly match, precisely match, something that I think we take for granted today. And the cost of implementing any new technology also drives the initial market value. So the investment in copper plates, rollers, skilled labour, and maintenance was not cheap. But in the early 19th century, it must have made good business sense to the ceramics industry to produce these wares, as all levels of society own these desirable ceramics, including the aristocracy and including the royal household. And we have evidence of George IV possibly give a gift to one of his mistresses, but an entire service. So now larger services were available to more and more consumers in many different styles. And the 1820s onwards saw a revival of the Rococo styles, particularly in Britain. Loosely, very loosely, copied from 18th century porcelain, Staffordshire patterns with ground colours and shaped panels in the reserve became incredibly popular. And I will just mention one of my previous directors, Ros Saville, always saying to me, the difference you can spot between an 18th century flower and a 19th century flower. The 19th century flower always looks a little bit too heavy for the stem to support it, so bear that in mind. More is more. This Spode pattern of about 1820 to 30 was also made, talking about choices, in claret red, if you can imagine, apricot, lime green, and 3 shades of blue. And the shape of this tureen, with its moulded handles and scrolly bracket feet, follows that of more expensive contemporary silver or Sheffield plate. And it's interesting, the growing use of tureens in the early 19th century allowed food to be kept warm, whilst the elaborate shapes and decorated lid added considerably to the splendours of the sideboard or the table. This tureen is part of a service that was acquired by the V&A from Miss H.M. Gulson, who'd inherited it from her uncle Josiah Spode IV. And although at the time the V&A wished only to accept a token number of pieces, because of the impossibility of displaying the service in its entirety, and we're talking about hundreds of pieces in this service, eventually the museum agreed to take all rather than destroy the integrity of a documentary service. So since 1902, when we acquired it, the service has largely remained in store. But the British galleries now provide a fitting display of the many different shapes used in the service. And the Spode family provenance suggests that the service should represent the grandest and most opulent porcelain made at the factory in Stoke-on-Trent in the last years of the Spode ownership before it transferred to Copeland's. Now, interestingly, in this period, we see an increased access to exhibitions, publications of historic objects, and advances in technology and academic study, which really lead in part to a revival of interest in historic designs and techniques. The rediscovery of Bernard Palissy's ceramics led a number of French ceramicists to work in the style, and Minton's Palissy wares, as they were called, and now we refer to them as majolica, sold from 1849. Now, majolica tablewares were made, but more often it's the decorative shapes and accessories and centerpieces which suited the change here from à la française to à la russe dining, and also in terms of the body of the ceramic, the more hefty pieces that we're seeing really pinpointing the layout of the table. And as one writer in the women's periodical The Queen wrote in 1874, and I quote, "We imagine before long no dishes of either fruit, cakes or sweetmeats will be placed upon the table, and their place occupied by flowers and ferns. And there would, of course, therefore, also be more room for ceramics." A drawing in the Sèvres archives shows the designs for a monumental table centerpiece designed earlier in 1834 by Claude-Ami Chenevard, and one of the tazzas with the lid shaped in the form of a satyr playing a flute surrounded by dead game was later produced in majolica, exhibited at the 1855 exposition, and then acquired by the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I show it here, and you can see it on display in our galleries on the top floor of the V&A. So centerpieces that work just as well if filled with food or not, because here we have the satyr can come off if you want to use it for food, but then it stays on if you want it more as a decorative piece. These types were also produced by Minton and other factories. And another strong influence on Western design came from Japan in the second half of the 19th century. Commercial and diplomatic ties were being established between Japan and Western nations in the mid to late 1850s, and during the second half of the 19th century, large number of prints were exported to Europe, and the arts of Japan were exhibited at international exhibitions. These objects were avidly sought by Western collectors, artists and designers, and developed what we refer to as Japonism. Shown at the International Exhibition of Paris in 1867, this service was one of the first to be inspired by Japanese designs, and was highly influential in both France and England. Designed by Félix Braquemont and made by Leboeuf Mier and Criel, commissioned by the Paris-based designer and dealer François-Eugène Rousseau. Braquemont takes the images from published drawings, then published by Hokusai, some of which we have in the V&A, and I show alongside. And the service was actually given by Rousseau to the South Kensington Museum, today the V&A. The arts and crafts is an incredibly important period in the 19th century, but actually is most strongly associated with handcrafted, unique objects, and not the multiplicity of associated with dining services. Many of the consumers of the arts and crafts types of ceramics really rekindled a love affair with blue and white Chinese porcelain for dining. And so true arts and crafts tablewares of the period are generally limited to condiment sets, serving platters and centerpieces. And as shown here, a wonderful teapot made by Eliza Simmons at the Dalton Lambeth factory. Many of the modellers and decorators were trained at the nearby Lambeth Schools of Art during what is considered a golden period of arts education and a resurgence of craft skills. The objects made showed the human hand and include the initials of the decorators marked underneath, and really would have shown the owner's preference to these individually made, albeit factory objects, as opposed to mass manufacture. However, mass manufacture could produce good designs, and this dinner service by Christopher Dresser is made of earthenware, the cheapest of the ceramic materials, and the decoration is transfer printed, the least labour-intensive method. However, it does have features which lift it out of the ordinary and fits with the late 19th century ideas of design reform, being that an object must be of clean design and functional form. And Dresser's commitment to practicality led him to include a dip in the soup plate, which you can see here, helping, if you're using it, to scoop the very last spoonful of soup. And also the plates of the service, which I don't show here, have indents in the rim for condiments so that you can adjust the taste as you go along. And Dresser was perhaps the most radical and prolific of 19th century designers. He's often described as a pioneer of modern design and promoted quality machine production and new materials, so that more and more people could afford good design. So coming towards the end of the 19th century, this whistle-stop tour I'm taking you through design styles of the 19th century, we see a birth, as many of you know, of the new style in European art and design, later referred to as Art Nouveau, emerging in several countries at once under different names and in separate artistic disciplines. The common characteristic of Art Nouveau is often referred to as the whiplash line that seems to have a life of its own. It writhes and coils with dynamic force as if trying to break free from the forces holding it in place. And it's everywhere in early Art Nouveau works. And I just love this Nymphenburg service in the V&A collections. And this the example here, the sinuous irregular shape painted in purple, green and gilt with images of the sea. I mean, just perfect for eating seafood and likely really to be used for anything else, I would argue. It's the artistic creation of the sculptor and painter Louis Levallois and the painter Hermann Gradel. And finally, I'm talking about the long 19th century here. So we're tipping into the 20th century, if you can bear it. And I have to include the Gilded Age, which really shows how some styles will never fade. And that is certainly true for 18th century French styles. During the first quarter of the 20th century, Tiffany, New York, commissioned very fine and elaborate tableware services from Royal Crown Derby for their private clients. The most celebrated of these, arguably, is this ornately painted and gilded service created around 1909 for Judge Albert H. Gary, a corporate lawyer and founder of the United States Steel Corporation. Gary collected a substantial amount of art and antiques during his lifetime, housed in his Fifth Avenue mansion in Manhattan. It's possible that the service was used during the famous Gary dinners, at which steel executives from other companies were invited to discuss matters of mutual interest and concern. Due to the quality and style of the gilding on the Royal Crown Derby service, it's thought to complement the 566-piece plate gold service, also commissioned from Tiffany around 1910. And the complete effect of the table set with services would have been quite dazzling. I couldn't get an image of those services in use, but I do show you here a wonderful image from 1909 at the Waldorf Astoria. And when I came across this, I did wonder, where are all the women? I mean, at this time, in another room, or are they not invited? Well, who knows? But it just shows you the scale of the dining at the time. So the Royal Crown Derby service is noted not only for its large number and variety of pieces, but also for the exquisite quality and attention to detail. George Darlington, principal gilder, and his team took 2 years to complete the lavish raised gilding on the entire service. The floral reserves and cartouches were painted by Gregory, and each piece is signed by the artists and the gilders involved. And this, as I say, the service shows the continuation of taste for a heavily ornate mid to late 19th century style, particularly in the American market. Much of Gary's art collections were sold after his death at auction by the American Arts Association in New York in 1928. And the collection sales, selling for a total of $2,297,763, established an auction record for a single owner's sale at the time. A selection of pieces from the service, which are now in the V&A, were actually passed through the family rather than being sold, and were later sold at auction at Sotheby's, New York in 1998, and later bought by Dr. Thomas Emerson, who generously left them to the V&A Museum in 2011. And so they are on display in our ceramics galleries on the top floor if you want to see them. I hope this has given you a sense of the wide-ranging design styles developed over the very long 19th century and highlighted some of the various acquisitions, old and new, made by the V&A. But I should finish by encouraging you to visit the V&A. I know many of you go regularly, and indeed this week we're opening our new entrance, so if you want to see the first grand architectural change to the museum in 100 years, now is the week to do it. But when you need a little respite, and should anyone wish to get a sense of dining in the 19th century, then you can't get better than the original café of 1868 to 74, decorated with Minton, Moore & Co tiles, and it's a wonderful experience. Many thanks.